Without further ado, everybody, the state of the states.
Thank you, Don, and thank you again for all your hard work in the industry, Don. We all owe you a debt of gratitude, so thank you. Again, my name's, hand up for Don. Again, my name's Grant Giat. I am the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at DroneUp. And this actually is a really interesting panel for me because much of this was a struggle we have faced as in our partnership with Walmart. We're one of the drone companies that have a partnership with Walmart, like Zipline and Wing as well. And we've rolled out across 6 states now. And each state, I shouldn't even say state because it's really this locality that can sometimes be the bigger challenge. But each state presents its own unique challenges. And we spent a large chunk of last year dealing with a city in Florida that, or actually no, it was Florida legislation that it basically threatened to curtail the infrastructure we need to do our drone delivery. So we worked with a consultant and were able to get a unanimous law passed in Florida that allows the drone infrastructure to be built for the delivery operations. But that's just one example, and the cost savings on that was huge. So the application of a fire code, a building code, some out-of-place regulation to drone operations and infrastructure can cause millions of dollars of frustration and severely impede the progress of this industry. So we're here to discuss some of those issues and how we can avoid them. Real quick, I want to introduce my panel, some amazing people. We have Aaron Ressler, who's the Deputy Executive Director at the Northern Plains UAS Test Site. We have Catherine Cahill, the Director of Alaska Center for UAS Integration. James Grimsley, Executive Director of Advanced Technology Initiatives for the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and an amazingly talented bass and guitar player. Joshua Turner, who's a partner in telecommunications and technology practice at Wiley Ryan, and Josh has done a great job fighting, the avigation challenges and the other movements by the states to try and basically impede upon the federal government's regulatory authority over the airspace. And then finally, we have Dave Whitaker, who's the Chief of Development with New Air. So I want to welcome all the panel. I'm going to go ahead and hand up for them. I'm going to go ahead and dive right into something controversial, which I'm no stranger to controversy, so we might as well go there. And we're going to go right into this, as Don just mentioned, the Mercatus Institute's, the Mercatus Center, their state drone commerce rankings. And like we said, it's almost like not a pageant, but a competition. Every year we're waiting to see who's number one. And, unfortunately, I'm from Louisiana. I don't think we're last on the list, but we're last on a lot of lists. So I'm thankful that drones is not one we are. But thankfully, the chairman of the aviation subcommittee, House Representatives Garrett Graves, is from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So he's working really hard to expand the industry, not just in Louisiana, but nationwide, because we really need that. So I'm going to go straight to Josh, who again is a partner at Wiley Ryan, who's done a great job leading the charge to make sure the sovereignty of the federal airspace is preserved. And Josh, I want to ask you, can you define the criteria the Mercatus Center uses to rank these states?
Well, so that's the thing, right? I think you need to be very careful when you look at lists. And, it's very easy to sort of say, here's a list of the states that are ahead and the states that are behind, but ask yourself, what are they ahead and behind in? And one of the things that really struck me when Mercatus started doing this is that they were really focused on this idea of the avigation easement. They were focused on this idea that private property owners had a right to prevent people from flying over their houses, and that the way to deal with that was to set up these avigation easements where local jurisdictions would set essentially highways in the sky where drones could fly. And that was their idea of being prepared for drone commerce. There are a number of legal problems with that, and I would say that sort of on many levels, that is not the right way to think about the way the airspace works. It's certainly not the way that I would rank states by their readiness for drone commerce. And so one of the things that AUVSI did, and it's great to be back here at LawTech Connect, in connection with Exponential, one of the things that AUVSI did was put together the Drone Prepared Program, which is a sort of alternative way to think about readiness for drone commerce. And it is, a set of principles that you can look at. You can go to the website. They've got a whole thing about it, including some draft model legislation to help people sort of understand that, no, there really is a better way to get your state ready to welcome drone commerce and AAM commerce. There's now an AAM version of it. And to create the conditions that will allow these kinds of companies to flourish. And it has nothing to do with navigation easements. It has to do with smart legislation that clears the way for this kind of stuff to operate and creates the conditions necessary for innovation to take place in your state.
Are you happy with the criteria?
With the Mercatus criteria? Yeah, I would say that I don't find them to be that useful.
I figured that might be your response. Certainly there's a mixed array of responses in the industry about that. I want to ask the rest of the panel, how accurate do you guys think this criteria is for determining how drone ready a state is? Anyone? The floor's open. Kathy?
I'll start, and I promise I will pass. So I agree. I think if you look at what the report is set to do, right, of talking about commerce, and that's critical when you're looking at the Mercatus report versus drone prepared, AVSI's drone prepared. The Mercatus report gets summarized as drone preparedness, but it is actually a commerce report, meaning how can a state make money off of UAS operators and operations? And so all of the criteria in there, and especially the weighting of the criteria, talks about how can the state get money out of UAS operations. So it actually is a horrible report in that sense because it makes more barriers and more hurdles for UAS operators to get into the space. And I say that recognizing North Dakota's ranked number 3 on that list. So,
go ahead, James.
Okay, so full disclosure, in the past I have been an external reviewer for the Mercatus Center. I was not involved in any of these studies. So
you're fair game then?
Yeah, I'm fair game. Okay, so anyway, this, and exactly like Aaron was saying, there's so many different lenses. And one of the things, when we started the whole test site thing, when really we started getting excitement about 12 years ago, it was this economic development thing. If you can get a test site, you do this, you're going to be so far ahead. There's billions of dollars just waiting on the table for you. And it drove a lot of unrealistic expectations. And what happens in industry like this, especially very heavily regulated industry, is it happens in waves. If you look at the industry, the companies that have received a lot of investment, they went out, we see these waves. And so it's not always the first wave that makes it through. We're seeing something a little different in AAM. It seems to be a little bit more sustained. But I think, one of the ways the Choctaw Nation looks, and I have a state hat, so I'm an Oklahoma State official, I'm also a tribal official. But I can tell you the way the tribe looks at it. We don't care if we're number one or whatever. We see the benefits for our tribe. And so we see that we're going to be a major user. It's going to solve some problems for us. And so we do see ourselves in an opportunity where we can lead for tribes and we can share what we learn. We're not necessarily concerned with being first or whatever. We want to do it responsibly. We want to work in a way that the tribes benefit from it. So I would argue that sometimes we get caught up in these rankings of first and second, things like that. And any of us that's been involved in business, it's not always best to be the first. It's really expensive to be the first. Sometimes it's very expensive to be the second. And sometimes the big successes are number 3 or number 4. And so I think we get caught up into that ranking sometimes when we just need to be thinking about the most important thing. We get through the regulatory process, we do it safely, but also that we do it in a way that society accepts it. I've been absolutely surprised at how receptive the communities are within our reservation. They're ready for it. We have not received the pushback that I would have anticipated. So I think we need to focus on just engage with the communities. I think a lot of the hysteria is over with. And a lot of the early legislation was that knee-jerk reaction to hysteria. We got to stop this crazy drone thing right now before, the skies were going to blacken. If you remember Washington, D.C. in 2015, it was going to be the apocalypse at Christmas morning. So many drones.
We have one every 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, we have that. So, but it didn't happen. But I do think that, if you engage your communities, I think you're going to see a very realistic, rational discussion now. We're past the hysteria phase.
Real quick, James, I have to chime in real quick. You talked about community engagement involvement and not receiving complaints. That's amazing. And I think it's the same for the drone delivery companies as well. Wing, Zipline, DroneUp. Really, the communities have been very accepting. There is one kind of strange complaint we had in one of our states, and it's the only real major complaint we've had. It's a woman who said that the drones, keep in mind she lives within 5 miles of an airport. She said the drones were scaring her horses and thus they stopped breeding. Literally, drone deliveries caused her horses to stop breeding. So there are just some people that are going to have a problem no matter what. And it's just strange, but that's exciting to hear that the people in the community have been embracing it.
And I got a quick story on that. We had a rancher call all the law enforcement and said that one of the really big drones was chasing him and his family at night with a spotlight. And so law enforcement went out, and as they were talking to him, he reached and pulled a flask out of his boot and was drinking out of a flask while he was telling the story. So they just closed a notebook, and that was the end of the investigation.
That'll do it. Kathy?
So from the point of view of Alaska, these indicators stink. All of them are like, well, what can you do in terms of corridor over roads? Well, 82% of our communities are only reachable year-round by air. Of our land, 0.4% is privately owned. 12.3% is going to be owned by the tribal nations when we are done with the conveyance from Anilka, meaning the original divvying up of Alaska. So what is most of the land? It is federal government and it is state. So in terms of those economic concerns with landowners and overflying, that is a very, very small portion of our land mass. And so when you look at the criteria, they're specifying, well, can you do corridors over roads? Well, we don't have roads. What about local communities? Well, we don't really have that many that you would be overflying. So what we have found really is we have the need. Our communities are very accepting of this because it's the only way they get goods and services. Right now in Alaska, the cost of getting health care is less than the cost of getting people to health care. And when you happen to have a community that's fogged in and somebody needs insulin, you can't get it to them because you're using a pilot who's flying visual flight rules and they can't go into that foggy community. So if we can, with drones, come in and enable that delivery of that box of insulin, it's life-saving. If we can deliver more regularly versus with cargo, so things are not arriving both frozen and molded, which does happen, especially when we have weather events in the state, we've improved quality of life. So our communities are very accepting, and the community that actually is the most important and the most accepting is the aviation community. So we have done a lot of community outreach with the aviators in our state.
So you have a crude aviation industry that's very accepting of drones?
They are very accepting of drones. And so we go to the Great Alaska Aviation Gathering. We go to Fairbanks Aviation Day. We are part of the general aviation conversation. Our test site requires that all of our pilots be manned aircraft pilots, specifically because we're not going to throw something into the airspace without realizing the impacts of that to the people who are already there. And that has made a huge difference in the acceptance of what we happen to have. That is not evaluated well in the Mercatus report.
Completely, it's amazing to hear you discuss that because when we think of the United States, we don't forget Alaska, but we forget how Alaska is so vastly different than the continental United States. It's what, 2-3 times bigger than Texas?
Twice Texas plus North Carolina thrown in.
Wow, that's a lot of land. So a lot of places drones can reach.
Mm-hmm.
Dave, do you want to chime in on this as well?
Sure. So now from the bottom of the list, in New York, I will say from a regulatory standpoint, a legislative standpoint, has a long history of being sort of near the bottom of the list. We were the 10th state to ratify the U.S. Constitution, the first one, so we're not in a hurry. We do take our time, but things turn out right, and the focus is generally different. I will say, as an example, New York State leads in transportation innovations in historical terms, in terms of the Erie Canal, in terms of the first subway system. So it's not for lack of innovation, and I think that's true here. We got a slow start on some of the stuff in AAM, UAS industry, but we're starting to really turn that around with the state. They've invested significant dollars in it. We as an organization at New Era are starting to get the state, starting with the state agencies and eventually working into the commercial sector, starting to get them comfortable with the whole concept. I think, James, your analogy with the test sites is a great one, and the swarm of darkening the skies after Christmas morning. None of that happened, and I think those were the first legislations that they put in place. Nobody can take off or land from New York City, enough for the parks and all that. Even you'll see some of that. You are seeing some of that soften, where they're saying, no, it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. We just have to control it. So we're starting to get the rest of the state on board. I will say the other thing that New York has, it has a very diverse landscape, not quite as large as Alaska, but it has, half the state lives in a space about the size of Delaware, maybe smaller. The other half of the state is spread out over, a very large area with small cities in between. So it's a very good microcosm for the rest of the country because there are differences like that across the country, and I think it'll serve well as an example for the rest of the country over time.
Thanks, Dave. I'm going to ask Josh, is there anything you wanted to add about AUVSI's Drone Prepared? Because I think a lot of people are excited and want to hear about that.
Well, yeah, and it was a really great initiative. I mean, you've heard everyone talk about the concerns with Mercatus, and it isn't just Mercatus. There's a lot of folks who have, what I would think of as not productive concerns about the industry. I think one of the things that we're hearing about community acceptance is extremely important to sort of foot stomp, right? Which is that you need to have community acceptance. You need to get out into the community and work with the community and make sure that everyone's concerns are addressed. At the same time, you need to make sure that there aren't roadblocks or vetoes put up by local communities who are operating in a just sort of NIMBY space, right? We don't want that because we don't like it, because we don't know what it is. And one of the things that Drone Prepared aims to do is educate state legislators about the benefits of UAS, the benefits now of AAM, and the ways in which their state can change the law, make sure that local jurisdictions have their concerns properly addressed, but are within the framework of state law, so that there's state preemption, and work through all of the other ways that states can beneficially change their rules and regulations to make the states more welcoming to drones. There's also a component in Drone Prepared that we thought was very important, which is a legal presentation. And so for anyone here who's interested in sort of the nitty-gritty legal stuff about where federal law is and state privacy law and state, what kinds of public property law there is, we had a white paper that we did, and my partner Sarah and I put the white paper together as part of Drone Prepared. And if you want to read it, I encourage you to do so. It's really kind of cool to get the opportunity to geek out on that kind of stuff. It's available on the Drone Prepared website, and it gives you a good primer on all of these issues.
And Josh, I wonder, while you have the mic, I want to ask you and Sarah, your clients, do you ever encounter specific legislative issues they ask you about, whether it be drone-specific or ancillary legislation that affects drones tangentially?
Oh, yeah. There's a lot. I mean, AUVSI has a tracker on all of this stuff, and they're doing great work sort of keeping up with all of the various different states. But we frequently run into local jurisdictions or even state jurisdictions, although that's less true now, where there, and you mentioned this, Grant, the local or state law that would either intentionally or unintentionally prevent or really hinder the operation of drones. And so, in that kind of circumstance, one of the things that you have to do is go in and you have to educate the legislator or the local official about why this is a problem. And more often than not, they're very receptive, and you get good conversations, and there are, sort of core issues that they won't move away from, but more often than not, you can work something out. Occasionally you can't, and you have to litigate, and sometimes that's successful, and in other cases it's not, but that's just sort of the way that this whole thing works.
Right. Well, Aaron, I'm going to ask you about North Dakota. Are you seeing any... North Dakota has a reputation for being extremely drone friendly, but I'm sure even though it is, there's still sometimes issues that arise legislatively that impact operations. You want to discuss a little bit about some of those?
Yeah, happy to. So overall, the stance that I personally take, and I think North Dakota tries to take, is with regard to legislation, is less is more. I'll rewind the clock back to 2019. The state proposed a House bill that was going to add some language regarding UAS, specifically in a section of code that was on the interference of privacy. And if you look up the interference of privacy in Century Code, we have two general sections that just talk about, someone's reasonable expectation of privacy and what you can and cannot do. Great. But then they add to a third section that was specifically on UAS, that a UAS cannot be operated essentially to interfere with someone's privacy. And it's very limiting when you think about that, because the aspect of you're calling out one singular piece of technology. but what about all the other pieces of technology that could also be utilized to invade someone's privacy? And it didn't scale very well, and ultimately the bill did not pass. And I think that was a huge success for North Dakota. Now that said, I think there's opportunity for states to look at other programs and opportunities, potentially through legislation, that are drone and UAS friendly. A UAS grant program, or what we're actually trying to propose in North Dakota is a drone buyback program, and addressing the ideas of there are a lot of public safety and public mission set entities that have bought Chinese-made products that we now are starting to realize the concerns, the national security concerns those have. So can the state introduce a drone buyback program where we fund and support the buying back of those aircraft in support of blue UAS or American-made products that then limit the national security concerns? And so I think there's opportunities to go from the less is more concept into what can we do to be more friendly. But it is a very fine line that I think people need to be careful of.
And sometimes no good deed goes unpunished. Sometimes we see states and municipalities trying to enact legislation they think will help, but then they end up realizing perhaps they should have just let it be, but they have good intentions. So it's important to weigh that balance, because it's definitely concerns there. Kathy, do you want to talk about Alaska?
I did, and we were actually really lucky. The Alaska legislature ended up being really proactive. So when drones first came up, one of our main legislators was extremely concerned about them. And our program, at that point, was just the University of Alaska Drone Program before we officially became the Alaska Center for UAS Integration. And we sat down with the legislator and talked about the advantages, the protections, et cetera. And we formed a legislative task force to really look at the issues. What came out was one bill in the House that created the ability for the University of Alaska to create a training program for drones, and really just reaffirming that drones in Alaska were going to be flown like other aircraft in terms of warrants, what you do in terms of keeping photography, all of those other things. And so what came out was not restrictive. It was very much an aircraft is an aircraft, and how you would handle overflying somebody's property with a manned aircraft as the same as with a drone. And they went a step further and actually created a guide with all of the federal statutes and all of the Alaska state statutes that applied to commonly asked questions. Like, if somebody happens to be flying over my backyard, what can I do? And say, well, here are the federal regulations. You can't, take it out, all of those other good things. And of course, being Alaska, one of the questions was, can I shoot it? And the answer was no. For all these federal reasons, it is an aircraft, $200,000, 20 years imprisonment. And the last thing it could have sent back was an image of you shooting it, and things along those lines. And it was done somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but it really helped lay that foundation, working with the legislature, that this was not an adverse piece of technology. And the result is we've worked very well with the state and the legislature to be drone friendly and to not put in regulations. I think we only have two local regulations really on drones. One is Chugach State Park. They just had a horrific amount of drone implications. And the other one is force the salmon industry in southeastern Alaska. You cannot fly a drone to help commercial fisheries. It's an unfair advantage. It's just like with the normal things. You can't do airborne hunting. You can't do airborne fishing in this case.
I think it's really important. I'll give a quick example where, as an industry, we messed up. How many people remember when we were really fighting Don't Say Drone? You remember that? Oh, yeah. And we really made the public mad, because what it sounded like to the public was, if you were only smarter, you would know what to call it. That's a very offensive message to give society. Now what do we all call it? drone, right? We call them drones. And so I think we have to be careful with that messaging. But we're dealing with very complex issues. And like you said, a lot of these are not drone specific. And so if you look at like the privacy issues, if you go all the way back to the founders, there's two things you always have to keep in mind. That tension between states and federal government, that's intentional. That's because they couldn't figure out the best way. So they said, let's let it kind of meander back and forth. Sometimes it'll go toward the states, sometimes it'll go toward, the centralized federal government. And we saw it stabilize with legacy aviation. We've triggered a little bit of that discussion now, but we don't seem to see a political will to come to either side of it right now. So it's still kind of playing out. But I think the thing to think about is that there are real privacy arguments. You could argue that we pretty much lost a lot of what we would consider our privacy rights around 1998. They were already gone. We'd already succumbed to it. And there are legal doctrines, just like there are regulations that are outdated, there are some legal doctrine that's outdated, because if you think about what's happening, our founders didn't really have a privacy clause. They wanted privacy from the government. They didn't want tyranny. So that's why we have the Fourth Amendment. That was to protect us from the government. And so if you look at how that interplays with everything else, there's actually this really interesting interplay between the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment in terms of drones. When we start thinking about altitudes and things like that, we're seeing really interesting things emerge. The right to record, which actually came about, your ability and right to record public officials doing their job and stuff. And so that's how that started to migrate. So there's this public right to record. But then if you turn around and look at it, if I asked any room, I said, are there places where the police should not be without a warrant? It doesn't matter if you're a criminal or not a criminal. You're going to say, yeah, there are places that they need a warrant. They can't just march into your house and say, let's go start rifling through all your drawers and just see if you're doing something wrong, right? And so that Fourth Amendment principle, or that protection, is going to apply. But it's interesting how it informs our First Amendment rights versus our Fourth Amendment. Because if you think about it, if the courts, if you were to suppose a deputy goes and they fly a drone, they get 5 foot from someone's window, they look inside, they're doing something illegal, they bust the door down, arrest everybody, they get a really good defense attorney that mounts the Fourth Amendment challenge. The first thing the court is going to look at is, where was that officer? Assuming that the drone is an extension of that officer, where was that officer allowed to be with or without a warrant, right? And so that opens up a question that would ultimately say, well, what is public, what is private, where do you have your First Amendment rights? I mean, even public forums, I can't just barge into the post office and go to the postmaster's office and just start, even though it's a public, I can't go start rifling through his drawers to just see what's going on, right? So we have those things that we have to keep in mind. But I think as we move forward, it really comes back to, what will society want? What will society accept? Our laws, our regulations reflect the will of the people. And our regulations, in a sense, are a social contract. It's where we say, there's some concerns we have, but we see some good stuff, so let's kind of come up with this contract, how we do it. So I do think it's going to take a while. I tell people, let's let it play out, because I think people are going to see far more benefits. And I also believe that we have the ability to solve a lot of the privacy issues with technology. We really do. And the best example out there, in my opinion, was Google Street View. How many people remember when Google Street View first came out? And it was almost like a sport to go through it and find embarrassing things that people were doing. What building are they coming out of? What are they doing, Well, then Google fixed it very easily. They obfuscated and blurred. You have an algorithm that a human never sees that image, but it goes through, detects the human face and says, this is a problem. Let's blur this. Let's blur a license plate. For some reason, and I do not know why, Google Street View seems to blur dog faces, and so apparently there's some sense of privacy for dogs. But we can do the same thing. If you think about it, in the future, maybe we can obfuscate some details and just get what we need. So there's some creative things if we think about technology, but first recognizing that some of these society concerns are real. We have to err on the side of liberty and freedom, and sometimes that means let's be creative about how we do that. So.
And sometimes it's a challenge to, like I said a second ago, not regulate, realizing that erring on the side of freedom means pushing the brakes on it, right?
Exactly.
So, Dave, do you want to chime in on this for New York?
Yeah, so one of the things that we focus on is what you can do, not what you can't do. And I think that's what people kind of sometimes get hung up on, is all the restrictions that legislation puts on certain things. And I'll give credit to the FAA. They put Part 107 in place, and they said, here's all the rules and here's all the things you can't do, but if you make the safety case, you can waive any of them. And they put the onus back on the operators and the users to define what it is they wanted to do and why it made sense and convince them. And if you can convince them, then you can do it. Similarly, in New York State, we have a lot of legislation, and it's not a more is less, it's a more is more. In many cases, they like to legislate in the state, but they're also smart enough to know what they don't know. And a good example was when they first funded some of the test site activities back about 10 years ago, they took half of the settlement that they got from the tobacco settlement in 2015, I think it was, and they took half of that money and made it available to the state through a competition to win technology development by regions. And they awarded, I think, 4 or 5 different regions funding to do that. One of them was Central New York, and it was focused on UAS development. Because they recognized, even though they may not have understood it, and there's certainly issues with it, that this was an enabling technology that could have huge benefits to the state. Now, did they go as far as to legislate the fact that there was going to be an aviation department that would lead the entire state and cooperate who did what? No, they weren't that forward thinking, but they did put some funding in the state. They did start the process, and they kind of stayed out of the way. I mean, with a few exceptions of, like the legislation down in New York City not taking off and landing, they didn't put a lot of other legislation in there to restrict what could be done. Now, obviously, there's the FAA regulations that restricted much of what could have been done, and there's local restrictions that have impacted it in some places. But we've seen a very similar reaction to what the rest of the panel said. Is in general, when you get right down to it and you talk to people one-on-one, and that you take the fear factor away from it, they're very supportive. They really want this to work because it has the potential for huge benefits, economic benefits, safety benefits, societal benefits. So it's really about, again, our approach, take a look at the positive. There's negatives and you have to respect those for sure, but focus on what you can do. And that's one of the things we keep saying about even the FAA restrictions is, look, they'll let you do anything, but you got to work with them. You can't just complain about what you can't do. Make it work.
Thanks, Dave. Josh, I want to turn to you. And, we've talked about regulations, but of course, when you're talking about drone preparedness, there are several factors that go into it, such as the role of universities, creation of task force, of course, test site designations. Tell me a little bit about, what you're seeing from your clients in regard to these other supplemental ways to ensure we have a robust drone industry.
Yeah, no, and I'm going to take lessons from everyone on the stage because I think they're probably closer to this in some ways than I am, but it is certainly a key part of the drone prepared idea is that there are proactive, affirmative things that you can do to help this industry develop and to make the case for drones and for the uses of drones. And in fact, maybe I should turn it over to some of the other folks who are doing this stuff on a day-to-day basis.
Well, I'll start then. And so North Dakota, a long time ago, right, has always been a very pro-aviation aerospace state. It started with a lot of the work at the University of North Dakota, which has had the John D. Odegaard School for over 50 years now. It was actually out of that program that we really started getting into UAS in the first place. We had the UAS Center of Excellence at the university, and then as that kind of 10 years ago now, was wrapping up, the test site program came out. And so the test site program, 10 years now, a decade, was one of the first efforts where we really got very deliberately partnered with the FAA. But we didn't stop there. And so you talk about the other accelerators, the state of North Dakota's approach on this has always been one program is not enough. So yes, we are a federally designated test site. We are also a partner under the IPP program, which then led into our work with FAA Sure Research. Then beyond that to Beyond, and we will also be a part of Beyond. We have participated in the BVLOS ARC. We work with the FAA on the NTAP program, so the near-term approval process. If you haven't learned about that yet, that's a huge step forward for the UAS industry. As well as now we are working with the FAA on the FAA Radar Data Pathfinder program. that whole long list of, I don't know, 8 or 10 things that I just named. Why do we do that? And it's because we want to have a very, very deliberate, very wide cutting approach to our partnership with the FAA. And I think it's very critical for states to recognize that, to diversify their partnership with the FAA so that they, when we're tackling this small challenge of integrating UAS into the national airspace, we recognize that it's not just one program, it's not just one office. You have to interact with all the different flavors and dynamics and challenges with the FAA, and that's how I think you really have the accelerators is by doing that.
And the more diverse your programming is, the more people you reach. So the more programs you do to form this comprehensive approach, the better chance you have of improving public perception. And then that in turn can help shape the regulations, pro-drone, and the rest is history. Kathy?
So we, like North Dakota, are really on to the whole, we want the safe integration in the airspace, and really focusing on the word integration. So not segregation, not corridors, being able to fly with everybody communicative, and either through a UTM or through traditional air traffic control. So we too, test site beyond Assure, so which is the Center of Excellence. I sit on the Drone Advisory Committee, and we have exactly the same idea that we are reaching out, we are trying to bring together all of the different programs. And now this is a challenge, because what most people don't realize is most of these programs are not funded. So we are having to come up with the funding in order to be able to support pushing these boundaries. So in the Beyond program, we're actually using State of Alaska funds to help push this, because we feel it's important to the full integration and really moving the field forward. So what you're going to find is that the people who are up here, we are trying to work with the FAA in as many ways as possible to, Derek pointed out in terms of the Bringing Me a Rock, we've laid a really good foundation for our program with all those rocks. At this point, it looks like a beautiful castle. It's just missing those top crowning, heliports. But it is a case where we are really trying to move it forward. And I think every single person here is doing the same thing.
I really like that imagery. Very creative.
Yeah.
Castle.
So I've been in this industry a long time, and I remember back when you could take all the thought leaders and we could probably take up a couple of tables in Denny's or something, that's how far back it goes. But I spent several years in academia, and it was very eye-opening to me, and how you engage the public. And there are all kinds of things. I'm an engineer by training. Those are the hard sciences, math and science, engineering. There's another type of science that's the difficult sciences, and that's anything that deals with social perception or how we communicate or how we think, how we feel. And one of the things that was a big learning experience for me is how you engage people when you're trying to talk about something that they may not like or how they may not feel comfortable with. First of all, you have to have a conversation. It's the identity conversation. I am so-and-so. I belong to this. This is my ideals, this. So we have to get that out of the way and go through the self-identification of who we are and what group we're part of. But then we have to help articulate. And one of the biggest just eye-opening things that I came across was I would talk to people and say, well, what bothers you about drones or UAS? And they would struggle. They would just struggle. And it started to occur to me that as humans, we don't do a good job of articulating discomfort or things that worry us or things that scare us. We jump to words that really don't match sometimes. And what I noticed, I would watch the body language as they would describe what they were uncomfortable about, and then they would jump to privacy. And it finally occurred to me, they weren't concerned about privacy, they were concerned about proximity. And that's a totally different thing. And it made me think of when my daughter was, 9 or 10, and I would hear her screaming, telling her little brother, my son, to get out of her hair because she wanted her privacy. He wasn't reading through her diary, he was just in proximity in her bubble, and she didn't like it, right? So I think engaging the public, we have to be very careful, and we have to help articulate. And part of that is letting people go on the journey, because a lot of times you can help people realize there are already protections against those things that you're talking about. There's a protection there. We don't have to worry about that. We can enforce, we can do something. But another thing is there's a very important, and we see this playing out in society in a very dangerous way. There's a sort of this thing called the social amplification of risk perception. And that's the idea that each human, or the realization, we are horrible at communicating risks and threats to each other. So if I'm going to try to describe a risk or threat to you, Grant, I'm going to either make it sound worse, or I'm going to attenuate it, make it sound not that bad. We can never accurately. So what happens is that gets out of our control. And that's what we always have to guard against, is that social amplification that takes a life of its own before we have any sort of a meaningful dialogue. So it's complicated, but the interesting thing is when you go down that path with people, you see a much different response. And that's what we've been doing with the Choctaw Nation. We have those discussions, and you see a totally different perception, because now they feel valued. Now they feel, well, maybe you had some concerns or vindicated, but now I feel confident that they're being solved. It's a much different outcome and a much different conversation.
Dave, do you want to chime in on this?
The single biggest factor that's going to make this industry a success is positive commercial outcomes. And if you focus on that while maintaining an acceptable level of safety and working within the structure that the governments provide for you, then you'll be successful. If you look at all the startup companies that happen every year, all the technologies are very interesting, very cool. What separates the ones that last with the ones that don't last is their ability to find a way to make it economically viable for their customers and generate benefit that way. And that drives it. That's not the focus necessarily. It's not the only outcome, but it is the fuel that you have, the long range view that you have to take in any industry, including this one, is that. So work within the system and try to evolve the system as you can. Work with the FAA, work with, the industry groups like AUVSI and a Commercial Drone Alliance that push a lot of the legislation. That's good for everybody. It's good for the industry, not necessarily good for one company or another company or one state or another state. That's not what's going to win the day here in this particular industry. So,
Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, let me just follow up on that, because I think that's an incredibly important point. And it's something, someone mentioned, we were talking about privacy. Someone sort of held up a phone and said there are these other things that happen, right, in terms of threatening your privacy, and the phone is one of them. And one of the analogies I like to go back to a lot is that when cameras were first introduced on cell phones, 20 years or so ago now, people really freaked out about it. There was a lot of conversation about where should we allow cell phones with cameras? Should we not allow them in gyms or in bathrooms or in other public spaces? And there were actual laws passed about whether or not you could take your cell phone into the gym. That seems quaint and ridiculous now. We look back on that and we say, well, of course, everyone's got their phone. And the reason that works is because there was a positive commercial outcome. People understood the benefit of having that phone with a camera. They saw the benefit to them. They saw the benefit to the people around them. That's one piece of it. And the second piece of it is there was a set of mores that were developed around how you would use that phone. And so you didn't need a law to tell you, don't take pictures of people in the gym, right? That's something that we were all able to figure out on our own, and that became the sort of socially acceptable way of utilizing this new technology. The problem that I think we've had with drones is that the ramp has been slow enough that you haven't had that commercial success that really shows people this is going to benefit them. And in the absence of that commercial success, in the absence of that positive, you have a lot of fear, and you have a lot of uncertainty, and you have a lot of weird edge cases, like that company in St. Louis that was going to surveil everyone in the city, right? None of that is helpful, and none of that really, is the future of where this industry is going. And so I totally agree. The thing that we as an industry need to focus on is positive commercial outcomes, benefiting people, showing them how they're going to benefit. And before you get to scale, engaging with the community and telling that story in a way that answers the community's concerns about where this technology is going.
A couple things I want to add, Josh. First of all, you mentioned the convenience of phones and how the moment they became indispensable to us, we no longer cared if they were in locker rooms. Everyone has their phone in the locker room. I'm curious, once we're able to roll out these fast drone deliveries ubiquitously and everyone's able to receive products in under 30 minutes or so from either Wings, Zipline, Drone Up, whoever, I wonder then how the public would take that all of a sudden being taken back or curtailed. In other words, it's like Amazon Prime, right? When we all started receiving things within 2 days, we couldn't do without it. We still can't do without it. I'm wondering if it's just getting to that point where people realize they literally can get something within 30 minutes or less.
I think if DOJ wins their lawsuit, people are going to be really surprised about exactly how much worse their life gets, like very quickly, right? So
Right.
I think that's exactly right. There is a point at which this will become ubiquitous, and putting the genie back in the bottle is not only not going to be possible, but people won't stand for it.
Right, and the other point I'm going to add, because this ties into our last point, which is everyone's favorite topic, not at all controversial, avigation, and how do people have aerial rights in their backyard? Essentially, I know I didn't word that as artfully as I could have, but you know, when I used to do private practice, and clients would always ask about, well, first of all, everyone apparently in the world has a 16-year-old daughter who is sunbathing 24 hours a day. Like literally, I can't make this up. Every complaint is, well, what about, I have a daughter. Well, I know someone who has a daughter, and we don't want drones spying on them. Well, first of all, you know, make sure your daughter's wearing sunscreen, because the amount you think they're sunbathing, there's cause for concern. But we have laws in place to protect against privacy concerns, and because this industry has not yet scaled the way it could and should, I think people have not been able to see those statutes actually come into play and be effective, like trespass, property rights, ordinances, nuisance ordinances, things like that. So I do want to talk about avigation. Of course, I'm going to lead off with Josh, who led the charge against this whole effort to basically deprive the federal government of sovereignty over airspace. I know that's generalizing it, but that's in essence kind of what you're looking at when you say, hey, federal government, no, I, the state, have a right to dictate aerial trespass rights and aerial rights.
Yeah, I, the state, or I, the private property owner, and you're absolutely right. And there were, you know, this is one of those things I like to say. This is a battle that we fought 100 years ago, and we basically won on behalf of aviation, right? Because there was the same concern raised 100 years ago when airplanes were first introduced about how do you keep those airplanes from trespassing on your land by flying over it. And, you know, it very quickly becomes obvious that if that's your model, right, if the model is my land goes all the way up to the heavens, right, ad coelum, and no one can fly over my land unless I give them permission, and I'm going to monetize that permission, right? If that's your paradigm, then aviation never gets off the ground. And one of the interesting things that was happening in the early days of aviation were these sort of conversations about maybe the railroads would buy up all of these avigation easements and essentially prevent their competitors from being able to fly in places that weren't, sort of served by the railroads. That was a battle we won 100 years ago. It was a battle that the Supreme Court ultimately, in the Cosby case, which probably many of you have heard of, ultimately said, you know, obviously this idea of ad coelum is crazy. We can't have that and have a functioning aviation system. As we get UAS and to some extent AAM, although I think it's a little different conversation there. As we get UAS deployed, that conversation has been renewed, and people have said, well, now we're talking about flying really low to the ground, and so isn't that different, right? Isn't there a difference for really low to the ground? And there's actually a lot of fascinating law in this area. The answer essentially, I would argue, is no. It is not different. In fact, it's exactly the same as up higher, because the navigable airspace goes all the way down to the tops of the blades of grass. Now that creates some problems, and it creates some uncertainties about whether or not someone can fly a drone right over your front yard at ankle level or whatever. But those are problems that are solvable given the existing legal structures. They don't need a whole new set of laws and new set of legal paradigms in order to resolve. It's been fascinating being involved in these conversations with the Uniform Law Commission and then with the American Law Institute, who's in the process of revising.
Was that in Alaska, in fact? When
it was, yeah.
That's what I thought, because I remember that was a very
I got to go to Anchorage.
heated.
Yeah.
My dad was on ULC from Louisiana, and he was like, they're talking about drones. It was like shouting, wasn't it?
Yeah. People were heated. We spent 2 years working with the ULC to come up with a proposal that was sort of a compromise proposal that would recognize the primacy of existing law and apply it to drones. It was a lot of rooms like this one in various different places, and we went to Detroit and Washington. And I was really proud of what we ended up with. And then we took it to the main ULC, and I think this is a story of not having sufficient engagement. Everyone lost their minds. And there were a lot of people who were like, what are you talking about? This is crazy. You are taking away people's property rights. And we explained, no. If you sit down and you think about it and you go through this and hear this, the precedent, whatever, they did not want to hear it. They were like, nope. We're not going to be able to adopt this. And so that proposal, which I thought was quite reasonable, didn't end up being adopted because of the shouting. But it was fun to go to Alaska. I really enjoyed
Well, Josh, while you have the mic, real quick, because we're running out of time and I want to get everyone's final thoughts and their thoughts on this in general, I do want to ask you about the most recent FAA fact sheet. Because I know attorneys who practice in drone law, we rely on that heavily. I know I always did when I was advising clients, and they've gotten some pretty interesting updates recently.
Yeah, it has. And so in 2015, the FAA released its first fact sheet. It was a little bit ambiguous in terms of federal preemption and what was covered by federal preemption and what wasn't. It led to a lot of questions and a lot of debates. We almost immediately sought clarification from the FAA, said to them, look, you've got to do something a little bit more detailed than this. And it took 8 years for them to issue a clarification. This is a complex area of law, and there's a lot of politics involved. Preemption is not popular, no matter who you're talking to, and so it was hard. But ultimately, they did release the 2023 fact sheet, which I thought did include a number of extremely helpful updates. Unfortunately, the first court to consider the 2023 fact sheet was the Fifth Circuit, and anyone who is a lawyer in here probably understands the Fifth Circuit is probably the most hostile circuit in the country to the concept of federal preemption.
Yes.
I would argue to the concept of the federal government generally. And so the decision that the Fifth Circuit came out with, I think, really narrowed the application of the fact sheet in an unhelpful way. But that fact sheet, the 2023 fact sheet, is a great place to start if you have questions about the intersection between federal and state law. I would recommend taking a look at it. It's written in pretty accessible language. And I think we are going to see other courts deal with it in a little bit more honest a way than the Fifth Circuit did.
Well, and Josh, you raised a great point, and it's something, without getting political, it's something interesting that, there are certain people who are more, they think states should have unwavering sovereignty. There are other people who are more in support of a strong federal government. In this industry and space, I would argue it simply doesn't matter. You're creating a headache for yourself if you don't support the federalization of the airspace. If you don't support, you're talking about a nightmare of patchwork regulations if we don't stand behind the FAA and unite in this regard.
I think that's right, and I think the safety case is pretty obvious when you lay it out. It's really, really hard to say below a certain altitude we're going to treat aircraft as being subject only to state sovereignty, because it's really difficult to get from above that airspace to the ground without going through that airspace first, right?
So we just have a few minutes left. I'm going to kind of combine this topic, avigation, and how lessons learned with working with states and municipalities, along with final thoughts. So I'm kind of going to give everyone a minute to kind of talk about that and say anything else you'd like to say. So Kathy, we'll start with you.
Okay, so they saved the worst one for me to start with. So in terms of avigation, I do agree that we need to have the federal government in charge of this.
Yes.
Otherwise, every single Alaskan will say, I have the right to everything above my land, and if you fly in it, I get to shoot you. This is just the kind of the mindset is, we want our privacy, we want to be able to control the things around us, but we are a state that has a lot of land that is federal and state. So for us, it is very important that we have a continuity across these particular regions because, among other things, the land that is picked by the various native corporations, the state, et cetera, gives us a patchwork. So we could end up with something like the Navajo Nation where it is an actual patchwork of who has what property, and you couldn't go from one to the other because it's a checkerboard. So for us, it's very, very important that we are consistent on this. Our State Department of Transportation is very drone forward and is looking for how do we manage to do missions of import to the state. And if we start throwing in different jurisdictions, we're going to end up in real trouble.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kathy.
And I actually serve as a state transportation commissioner. So I'm the one that votes, makes those decisions. And a lot of times I vote against eminent domain. The newspapers in Oklahoma have started calling me the lone dissenter. That's my term. But I think we're going to have to be reasonable moving forward. Remember, if we can't focus on good business cases, this is what we're encountering with our community engagement meetings. We've had to retool those. People are like, we're kind of tired of talking about it. Just show us. Go show us what it looks like to have delivery. Show us that. We want to see it. We're tired. We've talked enough about it. So ultimately, we're going to have to show. And if public likes it, then typically our policy, our laws are going to reflect that. But at some point, we're going to have to start working toward, even if it's in limited areas, normalized operations that people can see. Drones are flying so much. There's not all this chaos and accidents. We have to demonstrate, because at some point, everyone will get tired of us talking. So that's sort of incumbent on us to start working through the business cases. But I think the public will actually be reasonable about this. I think we're going to find solutions that work out well, that doesn't throw the whole federalism debate into chaos or anything like that. I think we'll find some good ways to do it. Because remember, we do need the states and other jurisdictions' support and help. They're going to be making investments. There will probably be some need for enforcement personnel because the FAA and the federal government does not have that capacity right now. So we always have to think that the states, tribes, others are not our enemies. They should be our partners. Let's figure out how we work together so that we all benefit. And I think if we'll keep that lens and keep that perspective, I think things are going to go a lot better. The states that pass these crazy drone laws early, it's sort of embarrassing for them. Mm-hmm. And so that's what happens. You kind of, it's an embarrassment for forever until they take it off the books, So
first on navigation, I would say the federal rules of the air need to stay the federal rules of the air. But there is a role for states in this space. I know we got some students in the audience, so I know you're also falling asleep, a few of you. So pop quiz. If there was one barrier to UAS integration, what would you call it to be? Someone. The aircraft? Manned aircraft? Well, in particular, what's preventing UAS from going widespread BVLOS and taking over the world? Nothing? Rules? Regulations? Like just broad, overarching, right? So a lot of times we say, policy and regulation is the greatest barrier UAS has in this space. But I'm also going to challenge, and I'm speaking from a state perspective, there's a second challenge right behind that, and it's the lack of shared infrastructure. Mm-hmm. When most of you guys all traveled into San Diego, likely probably on an airplane, and you landed at the San Diego International Airport, you didn't land at the Delta Airport, you didn't land at the United Airport, you didn't land at the American Airport, you landed at the International Airport. That's shared infrastructure. UAS can take advantage of our airports, but that's not the infrastructure we need. We need C2, we need surveillance, we need a different form of infrastructure, and UAS is really the only industry within the entire transportation sector that does not have shared infrastructure. And that, I think, when you talk about aviation and now state of the states, that's the role that states can play. States can work on solving shared infrastructure and give the lessons learned back up to the federal government that's now going to set the standard for actually enabling UAS. Regulations still got to stay at the federal level, but the states definitely have a role when it comes to infrastructure.
Real quick, Aaron, I just want to add, I think that's where corridors, we've heard of corridors with states, municipalities, and even countries working together. I think those can come into play as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think I've said everything I can say about aviation and accelerators, so I'm just going to pass the mic.
I think it was Winston Churchill that once said, you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted all other possibilities. And I think this is a case of that, is you will come to the right answer. I'm not a lawyer. I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night, so, take it for what it's worth, but I think we'll figure it out. I can't imagine what a mess it would be if we didn't go with a federalized airspace laws. So I think that, again, that's kind of for me anyway, that's a foregone conclusion. I'm sure lots of lawyers will make lots of money and there'll be a lot of time along the way, but we'll come to the right conclusion. As far as making it work, I'm with Aaron. Do what's right for the industry, what's right for people, what's right for safety, and we'll come out in the right place. It's going to get noisy, it's going to get bumpy, but we will get there. And I'm confident.
Thank you guys so much. I had an amazing panel today. Let's give them a hand. Thank you guys.